That is really important for me, and that is really where I think humans need to enhance our capabilities of imagining the next thought implications.
Welcome to the Thriving on Overload podcast. I am Ross Dawson, a futurist and entrepreneur fascinated by how human minds create value from information, and author of the book Thriving on Overload. Every week, I speak to incredible people who share how they use unlimited information to create massive value and keep ahead of accelerating change. If you want to learn more about this valuable topic, go to thrivingonoverload.com, which includes podcast episodes and transcripts, excerpts from the book, articles. You can sign up for our weekly Tips for Thriving newsletter to help you improve your habits. And there are also details on the Thriving on Overload interactive course, which guides you through the journey of amplifying your information productivity. That's thrivingonoverload.com. Building on my work on Thriving on Overload, I'm also focusing on the theme of humans plus AI to help massively augment your productivity using artificial intelligence. If you want access to a raft of resources, frameworks, guides, and tutorials, just go to humansplusTechnology.com. If you find this episode useful, please do take just 10 seconds to hop into iTunes or whatever app you're using to listen to this to give the podcast a rating or a quick review. These are all free resources that would be massively helpful to me to make this project feasible and also help others to make this easier to find. On this episode, we learn from Roger Spitz. Roger is an international best-selling author of the 4-book collection, The Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption, the president of Techistentialism, which works on climate and foresight strategy, the chair of the Disruptive Futures Institute, and a frequent keynote speaker globally. Roger was previously a global head of technology M&A with BNP Paribas and has 2 decades of leading investment banking and venture capital businesses. You can find more on Roger's work at disruptivefutures.org. In this episode, Roger shares insights on the future of strategic decision-making, thriving on disruption, resilient systems and thinking, decision-making for climate impact, beginner's mind, and far more. Keep listening to learn from Roger's fabulous insights. Roger, delight to have you on the show.
Amazing to be with you, Ross.
So one of our many common areas of interest is the future of strategic decision-making. Mm-hmm. So why do we need to be thinking about the future of strategic decision-making?
That's a very, very fine point, right? What's changing? Because we're humans, we have a brain, we make decisions. So there's a lot of things, I guess, which I know you're also very tuned into. And for the anecdote, before I answer, thriving on disruption is meeting thriving on overload. So those 2 elements, disruption and overload, are contributing in a way to having to consider decision-making differently. So we box it into a few things. I think firstly is just simply that the exclusivity of decision-making is no longer necessarily just for humans. So insofar as computers can make decisions, whether they understand the decisions, whether they're imitating the brain, it's almost a separate debate insofar as the outcomes of what they might do have implications on decisions which may not be taken by humans. So the first thing is really that delegated authority, and which we call Techistentialism. What is technology and existentialism? What is that world where we no longer have that exclusivity? The second thing is the decision-making value chain itself. If you think of, you get information, like a OODA loop, you get information, you get signals, that's kind of descriptive. So the computers analyze that, it's data analytics, computers have been doing this for decades, fine. And then there's a bit more predictive. So that's algorithm augmented, machine learning, pattern recognition, you can process tons of, drug discovery, all the things, you can test and process millions and billions of things and decide what could make sense for a particular drug and that which humans cannot do. So that's, predictive. It's kind of supporting decision-making. Now, the thing that interests me kind of most is that value chain where decision-making is moving to prescriptive by machines. And that prescriptive is really deciding the preferred option. It's really having that kind of agency or at least authority with action triggers to make autonomous decisions. Now, your focus, thriving on overload, how much information is there to process? You need support for that. How good is the support you're getting with computers? And so that's kind of two elements. The exclusivity that's being delegated and the moving up the value chain. Now, what happens is that if you look at, we quite like to look at the framework of, obviously very helpful for sense making and responses to different environments, Dave Snowden's Kinnavan framework. And he divides,
yes,
obviously for your listeners, what is complicated and what responses for complicated. So complicated, you can rely on experts, you have known and unknowns, it's a more kind of linear, predictable environment, cause and effect kind of can be anticipated ex ante. And then complex, it's different. It's non-linear, so it's less predictable or not predictable at all. It's like the Amazon River. If you change something, how does it affect everything else? Complicated, the examples are how do you send a probe to Mars and all that. You can do the calculations and get expertise, how to fix a plane and that. So in this complex environment, cause and effect can't be necessarily determined ex ante. It's an emergent discovery mode, trial and error. Cause and effect can't be established necessarily ex ante, as we said, it's nonlinear. The multiple drivers of change can't necessarily establish just A or B, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a lot of the real world. And more in a world which is hyper-connected, which is technological, where things are basically very much playing off each other and can be self-reinforcing, the speed of which can be extraordinary. If you look at Silicon Valley Bank, one of the interesting aspects to it, and we can put aside the many aspects of the hundreds of case studies in the postmortem, but one specifically I think is interesting to our discussion is it's probably the first time that social media and information is the way it is. We didn't have that in the 2008 crisis. And where instantaneously, if one VC mentioned something to a customer or startup or whatever, that was pretty much amplified within minutes to tens, if not hundreds of millions or potentially billions of people. So that instantaneity, warp speed of many, many things basically mean that the decision making and the process in that complex environment is different. So when you add all that together, my worry and my concern in terms of what does it mean for the future of decision making is that machines will continue their course, will hopefully have improved ethics and safeguards and make the most of it for the augmentation because it benefits as well to AI. But putting that aside, my worry is that the focus is so much on the machines that we forget humanity, what we as humans need to do so that decision making remains effective. So what are humans good at in decision making? And then we'll kind of wrap up. I don't want to monopolize it. I'd love to get your thoughts as well and reactions. But basically, kinesthetic intelligence, right? You use your temporal lobe, timing, your senses, and all that. Emotional intelligence, we have instinct, we have intuition, feeling, self-awareness, consciousness. And you don't need algorithms for, it's not the prefrontal cortex where you kind of have that emotional intelligence. Now, the one thing with what we're talking about, though, is for strategic decision-making, which is our topic, complex systems. In that quadrant of David Snowden's Kinnavan framework, where there are those unknown unknowns, computers aren't that good yet at complex because it's non-linear, because there's no data on the future, it's unpredictable, because cause and effect is not determinate, etc. But with natural language processing and machine learning, it's emergent. It's quite good at being emergent because it's everything immediately is kind of taken into account. So the machines are learning fast and potentially encroaching, or even if they're not, are being delegated authority to process things and make decisions, even when it should really be that the humans keep the edge. The problem is that if the humans are not upgrading themselves to the reality of our nonlinear, complex, unpredictable world, if we're not changing the way leadership teams and our minds are cabled, if we're not changing the educational systems, we're not good at making sense of complex. We're not good at processing and making decisions in those environments because we're linear. We're just not capable like that. And so, long story short, when I think about the future of decision making, I think more about what do humans need to do to upgrade their capabilities in the context of Techistentialism, where we don't have exclusivity to decision making, where we're de-skilling by delegating authority to machines, and where those machines are moving up the value chain and learning every day. Are we?
Yep. Yeah. Well, that's it's a extraordinary time to be looking at that. But let's unpack that and look at that. Completely agree that this has to be about augmenting human cognition, and that the augmentation of human cognition could be partly in terms of that delegation where relevant. But it comes back to, in a way, the prescriptive that you described, where the analysis is provided by machines. But prescriptive isn't delegation. It is prescribing something, but you can still choose whether or not to take that medicine.
If you're capable of making that decision,
Yeah. So that's the I suppose the nub of that is that precisely when we start to have, for example, and this is partly a sequencing issue, where you say, first of all, AI provides a recommendation, hopefully with justification or some kind of parameters and so on, and then human says yes or no, or with modification. Another is to, I suppose, there's and various other sequences, ones where humans provide analysis and then get this AI to assess different scenarios or things like that. But what's the nub, or I suppose what are either the best way or ways in which we can then take that prescriptive approach where they're getting some rich multivariate analysis by AI, but where it still remains ultimately a human decision?
Yeah. So listen, I completely agree with you. Prescriptive is not taking autonomously a decision. It's providing the options to make a decision. Where I would add nuances is we're less good at bluffing than machines are. So several things can happen with that prescriptive, which theoretically is not the decision-making, but which can quickly become a proxy for decision-making. Number one is, are we overwhelmed by the complexity, and are we actually understanding what the machine has done, what the machine is prescribing, and what to do with it, and our own situational awareness and understanding to make a decision? So that does require us, probably, we can see it every day, when there was a pandemic, when there were a lot of the recent geopolitical events, when we are in this environment, which is the reality of the world, that is nonlinear, unpredictable, and complex. It's just that the cost of making the assumptions of relying on assumptions is going through the roof. So we used to make the wrong assumptions all the time, but the cost of those assumptions were less severe. Now the issue is the cost of making the assumptions of linearity are wrong. We therefore have to have a different mode and acknowledging the real nature of our world, including in our decision-making. Are we able to? Are we changing the incentive, the governance structures, the educational systems to allow us really sufficiently to understand what machines are doing, their limitations, whether it's garbage coming out, to understand the situations well enough? And are we delegating sometimes things where we may not be better able to make the decisions based on the answers than the machines, but even machines themselves can make mistakes or can be wrong. The algorithms, God knows what happens there. So I'm not dismissive of technology nor of AI, because there's a lot of miracles that are happening through that. It's like often it's the tensions and dualities and paradoxes. But I think then if we move to your question around how does one kind of manage that decision making and what do humans do, we can unpack that. But it does require, for me personally, I do use technology constantly, and I guess that's kind of what you're driving at. There's uses where technology augments us, and it's, whether it's note-taking or translations with machine learning or transcriptions or indirectly drug discovery because the farmers are using platforms with AI. So indirectly, one benefits and one uses it every day at the personal level, at societal level, etc. What I then try and do is really, focus a lot on, and this is where I think humanity needs to do, is what we call the AAA, which is how to be more anticipatory and think about the future, because we need to imagine broader scenarios, and we need the time to think of things differently, to kind of unwind. We need to take a breath, and there's a lot of noise and overload, as your book correctly points out. So you need to isolate the time to think about different things or think differently from the linear approach. And I think Foresight and Futures is a good way of doing that. It's quite broad and that. You need to isolate the mind, sometimes even spending time doing other things, to just invest 10, 20% of your time to connect the dots and see things differently, because the same way of looking at things and developing more expertise compared to sort of, being T-shaped or benefiting from the compound rule of kind of investing in time, you have to isolate your time. You have to isolate the breathing and the thinking differently, whether it's Eastern philosophy with Shoshin, beginner's mind, whether it's meditation. And then you need imagination, inspiration to accept that the world may not be as it is and to be able to challenge that. But this is very different from the educational system, leadership, governance structures, and incentives that we're determined to do, which really give you a carrot to learn things for which there are ready-made solutions and answers.
So let's sort of get real world. I mean, this is all important topics, and I think unpacking them as you have in your books, I think, is really valuable. So you and I both work with boards and executive teams, and so then you get personalities, you get more or greater or lesser openness to different ideas or to new technologies. And so what's the realities? I mean, have you seen any boards or executive teams which have, advanced, have superior or advanced or better or interesting process of decision making? Or have you encountered any interesting any anecdotes to recount around how you have tried to get groups to adopt better decision making processes?
Yeah, so you're right. There's a lot to unpack, and I like the provocation around the getting real, right? So I think a few things. First of all, is that it's hard. You're talking about changing mindsets, ways going against how we're capable to think maybe more linearly. So it's hard, no doubt about that. That's why these are complex challenges. That's why we've deferred them for decades, even though we knew the consequences for some. So no doubt about the challenges. The second element is that I think that at present, unfortunately, quite a lot of organizations, countries, institutions are still business as usual operating mode in terms of relying on usual assumptions and everything, treating the world as controllable, predictable, linear. Having said all that, I find that there are more countries that are beefing up things they're not bad at already in terms of being anticipatory. Singapore, Canada, some Scandinavian countries and that. And those who aren't are starting to realize the importance of that and being more intentional around them. US, maybe to a degree, and others.
So this is around policy?
Around policy. And organizations, likewise, around capacity building for better resilience, for foresight strategy. And I see it myself. One of the reasons I'm able to do what I do today, which 5 years ago would have been maybe a bit more esoteric. Not that there weren't futurists or very bright people like you who have been doing this for a long time, but coming out of nowhere, out of 20 years of M&A, to be able to kind of fit myself and get traction for capacity building, for anticipatory governance, for resilience, for strategic foresight. I'm not sure that these kind of topics would have had more demand. You've always had a very small number of organizations that were well capable on that. I'm finding there's more interest in these, and more, not just keynote talks, but actually kind of executive programs or pathways to capacity building. It's not easy. That's not because you do a good session, even if you're effective and people are well-intentioned, that is easy. But I'm finding a lot of interest in that. I'm even finding the same for education, for that matter. I'm seeing private groups who have educators who are asking me to do sessions for them to think about how to better allow their students to be capable with these topics. And, if you take the leverage points and Donald Meadows, when you're dealing with education and then policy and then the corporates, little by little, you're doing a lot with the value chain around the drivers for change. In terms of coming back to your question, so the being anticipatory, which is one of our AAAs and strategic foresight and those capabilities, I'm seeing more and more demand for. It's better to have the awareness and the demand than not. So I think we're less and less relying on some well-known institutions who have their DNA in terms of this way of it being anticipatory. I think it's becoming more relevant to more people.
You are listening to the Thriving on Overload podcast. If you truly want to increase your information productivity, then check out the Thriving on Overload interactive course. It is designed to significantly enhance your information practices and habits, guiding you through creating your own personal information plan so you can excel in a world of overload. Go to thrivingonoverload.com/course to find out more. Now back to the show.
So one of the challenges with foresight, the anticipation, so you can be in a mindset of anticipation, and you can get foresight methodologies and internal, or get some great people externally and so on. But that's always originally the whole thing was scenarios to strategy. All right, we've got some great scenarios. How do we turn those into strategy?
Yeah.
And I that's something which I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
But it does, and also the strategy is again around the decisions. And I think there's plenty of organizations again that go out and get some insights around the world far more than other organization leaders do. And so they're more open and they look for things and they get help and they build foresight teams and so on. But there's still, how does that flow through to an actual decision? And so that's still the snub where you've introduced more complexity. You've made it harder in a way because you're bringing in more complexity, but that's still then, how do you, from that anticipatory frame or the actions you take, how does that then flow through into a decision-making process?
Yeah.
And a decision at the end of that.
No, for sure. And that's one of the reasons why we don't focus, for us, the capacity building is not just foresight strategy or capabilities, because to your point, you need to think about the outcomes. So the simple answer is incentives determine outcomes. And that's not me, it's Munger, of course. But ultimately, there's certain things in terms of the way the leaderships are cabled, the type of things to achieve alignment, the way of achieving certain outcomes that come through incentives and other means. If an organization is serious around changing how people think and behave and more outcome focused, then kind of tick the box, we have a team that does a bit of foresight or whatever, clearly you go to the core of it. And that's where we think about things. We don't, anticipatory is more this kind of foresight, futures thinking. We then add anti-fragile, borrowed from Nassim Taleb, but where we look at, what is the organization? How rigid is it? How the decisions made? How resilient to shocks is it? How does risk management work in terms of asymmetries? Are people still thinking that, if it's just 1%, it's fine, but if the 1% ends the world or your company, it's an existential question. You need to look at the asymmetrical risk. So anti-fragility, which includes ways of having skin in the game, and it's linked to decision-making and it's linked to incentives, actually has very important elements, which we unpack quite considerably in our frameworks in Volume 2. Even though we didn't invent anti-fragility, I think we applied quite well as to how it ties in with anticipatory and futures thinking. And then the third piece is again, decision-making, the scenario analysis and all that is very important. Everything is to inform decision-making today. So in coming back to the emergence, if you take complexity, everything is emergent. Only the today and the reality exists. So how do you constantly kind of zoom in, zoom out? And what strategic and emergent agility do you have to zoom in from your longer-term kind of envisioning and all that to emergence today? And that, again, has different elements that organizations can take on, in terms of decision-making, certain decentralization, training of people, the right incentives. So there's no quick fix. But I do personally believe that if you have certain incentives that are focused on the right outcomes, that if people are more aware of it, that you bring in talent that's kind of more susceptible to adopt this, that you have an understanding of being anticipatory, anti-fragile, and the agility to kind of emerge with decision-making today, reconciling long-term objectives as opposed to constantly firefighting because you're anticipating it, you're seeing the world differently, etc. Those combination of things with agency and then alignment are more likely than not to help. But yes, it's not easy, and not everybody is prepared to go through an understanding of the different facets to this.
So can you give an example? Let's talk specifics. So presumably either something you've seen where there's public information, or if there's a client where you can disguise the details, just some facet of whether it's worked or it hasn't worked, of how organizations or leadership teams can change or improve. What are specifics of how this has happened and how we've seen shifting in decision making?
Yeah, so let's take something concrete. So I'm, for instance, on the Climate Intelligence Council of a startup called Service, which is a AI company which is focused on climate intelligence. What's climate intelligence? Climate intelligence is basically allowing you to make decisions today on specific assets or investments based on very long-term uncertainties. So what the state of climate and the weather and resilience needed might be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's in the long term. It's uncertain. And basically, you need to make decisions today in that. So it kind of fits quite well with the different parameters. They basically, have 100 plus climate scientists. They've developed AI software. It's open source. And they basically spend a lot of time educating clients, the world, in many different ways, people like me, support, and others, around what are the worldviews and understanding what's happening. They are then supporting with the disclosures, with understanding what's happening with the regulators in terms of future disclosures. That would provide feedback loops. What are good disclosures, bad disclosures? They're helping companies themselves prepare for their accounts and all that with the required disclosures. As part of that, they are evaluating and giving a dashboard which helps you, without predicting because we don't have the certainty, but what helps you map out and plan the different possibilities for your assets over the next 5, 10, 15 years for the different possible climate eventualities, and see what your competitors are doing, what your assets are doing. So if you're a hotel chain with 200 hotels, you need to decide today. You need to understand, we all understand that mitigation is not enough for climate. We need to make our asset base and our lives more resilient and adaptable. What does that mean if I have a supply chain? If I'm a city and I have infrastructure? If I'm a hotel and I have 200 hotels, or if I'm about to make an acquisition? Basically, that hits, I think, if you take, leverage points and Donella Meadows in a complex systemic world, it's looking at all the different facets, because you're a CEO or board or whatever management team, you're looking and you can see, okay, I can see the different exposures and the different risks. I understand that it's not 100% sure that will happen, but it's a lot of information and things that can be really processed and mapped out in that. I see the different scenarios. You can decide how to make yourself resilient or not resilient for the different eventualities, etc. That might sound a bit basic, it's just capex or investments, but actually it's huge, because the resilience of the world, if there's flooding, we've had big wins in San Francisco. Suddenly, even Salesforce Tower and all these buildings that are built with the best architects and engineers in the world realize that you have glass falling through 80-story buildings or 30-story buildings because of how strong the wind is, leaks everywhere, things collapsing. And this is California. There are places where there's more extreme weather. So if you multiply that across the world for insurance, for decisions, for companies, it's trillions of dollars potentially that are exposed, not to mention the number of lives and all that. So this is, for me, decision making is not just kind of a company making decisions in a certain way, but it's also what they are enabling the world, society, businesses, organizations, countries, what decisions they are allowing them to make to be more resilient. And I think this is quite a good example because, I'm not pushing for them. I'm not, I'm rooting for them, but I'm not lobbying for them in that sense. But it really hits the different elements of long-term uncertainty, emergent decisions today that need to be concrete, building resiliency into our systems, and thinking, if you have the information, the mindset, and you can see you're able to make the decisions, you're not relying on, you're getting the data to then decide what decisions to make. So it's not a kind of black box in terms of what information is provided, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, as an example, that I think is not a bad example.
Yeah, well, certainly in terms of climate, I think that's it's a lot of uncertainty, massive impact. Decisions now are critical, and I think, as you suggest, in terms of having both the right sorts of information and the frameworks to assess it, I think is can be extraordinarily valuable, and the scope of information is critical.
Yeah.
So to round out, you obviously, I would say, thrive on overload. You soak in lots of information, you make sense of it. You are a Foresight practitioner, amongst other things. So I'd like to if there are 3 things which you do in your practices and how you work with information that you think might be useful for other people to consider in how they interface with information.
When I kind of saw your work, I was very interested because, first of all, the thriving on is something I had approached as well. But, it's probably one of the biggest challenges today, irrespective of how one uses AI to support or not, just simply the noise from the rest, okay? And to your point, as you professionalize Foresight and futures, the trick is that you're seeing even more things, right? Because you want to go broad, you're going beyond the fringe, everything. So I would say the 3 things are the following for me personally. Number 1 is when I'm looking to spot the weak signals, is to start allowing the themes to connect the shifting dots. In other words, and serendipity actually has a big role to play with that, which is why, for all the wonders of AI, serendipity is often where I get the greatest ideas from. I'm not, or I find them great. Whether the outside world does is another matter. But the ideas I'm proud and happy about often come from serendipity. So that's, as you're scanning a heck of a lot, seeing things, it's what patterns come, what clusters, not in a kind of AI, I've processed a million random things, but really in terms of you, Ross, or Sarah, or me, Roger, bringing that, connecting the shifting dots, what we call connecting the shifting dots. So the next thing, and that is broad, we're going outside of our field's expertise and everything we know. We're going wide, deep, etc. The second thing is, I think, thinking about what are the next order implications of that. At that point, I'm almost intentionally trying to drop the information, not to be overloaded. I'm trying to intentionally isolate myself with, whether it's through meditation or beginner's mind, Shoshin and Eastern philosophy, or how do I get a blank page to imagine and be inspired, the multiple possibilities, and think about the next order implications of what that means. There's no date on the future. So that is really important for me. And that is really where I think humans, to our earlier discussion, need to enhance our capabilities of imagining the next order implications, to enhance preparation and avoid surprise of things that are necessarily rushed or unprepared. And the third thing I think is it's really to kind of scan continuously in a way to evaluate and compare how things are changing. And again, it's very subjective. Sometimes it's inspiration even. It's not necessarily just monitoring data and creating feedback loops from what, the computer says. It's really thinking about how new do things feel, how might they compound, how might they impact, which then links to the next order implication. So, for me, it's connecting the shifting dots, imagining the next order implications, and thinking about that in a dynamic world, because it's constantly, the world is updating itself. So our ideas and our thoughts and our perspectives of the world also need to be emergent and constantly updated.
Yeah, and I think those are great. And I think we're pointing to, as as we were referring to before, the humanity. As in, this is what humans are good at, the way our brains work, and it's around the cognition. And I think that's fantastic to pulling out from this is the way our minds can bring things together. So thanks so much for your time and your insight today, Roger. It's fantastic. And just to round out, where should people go if they want to find out more about your work?
Thanks a lot for that. So I think to follow all the content, it's basically, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, etc., Disruptive Futures Institute. So follow the Disruptive Futures Institute, and the handles on Twitter and Instagram are @disrupt_futures. But Google us and you'll be fine, Disruptive Futures Institute. And if you're specifically interested in learning more about the books, there's a dedicated website, thrivingondisruption.com. And we also have detailed articles on every single one of the volumes to know what's in it, as well as podcasts and a lot of other information. So the dedicated book site, thrivingondisruption.com for the guidebooks, and then just generally follow the Institute, Disruptive Futures Institute. We're trying to beef up how much is free and available for anybody who just wants to kind of just have it there.
Fabulous. Yeah, great resources. And that'll all be in the show notes. Thank you, Roger.
My pleasure, Ross. Have a good rest of the day. Enjoy it.
Thank you for listening to the show. If you want more resources to help you thrive in a world of exponential information, go to thrivingonoverload.com, where you can find all podcast episodes, transcripts, show notes, excerpts from my book, Thriving on Overload, the Thriving on Overload interactive course, and a trove of other useful content and resources, including a weekly Tips for Thriving newsletter to keep across it all. If you like this episode, please do help us be found by giving us a rating or review, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more. This is Ross Dawson. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.